Good morning, everyone. Why don't we go ahead and get started? Welcome to the Atlantic Council. My name is Damon Wilson. I'm Executive Vice President here, and I'm really delighted to welcome you here for today's on-the-record conversation on President Macron comes to Washington, French-American relations in the Trump era. I want to encourage all of you to join us on Twitter during this event using the hashtag #StrongerWithAllies and following the conversation at AC Future Europe. Today essentially is a scene setter for the April 24th, what will be the first state visit of the Trump administration with President Macron. And it's also the backdrop for the release of our latest report on France. And for this conversation, we're delighted to have Ambassador Rowe here with us. Thank you, Ambassador, as well as a very special guest, Pierre-André Humbert, who's joined us from Paris, the social policy advisor to President Macron. I think the premise of our conversation for us at the Atlantic Council is that a strong, stable, and competitive Europe, and France in particular, is fundamental for a healthy transatlantic relationship. And a strong transatlantic bond, in turn, is the cornerstone of a stable and secure international system. Yet, as Europe faces itself both internal and external challenges, and the United States grapples with its extraordinary debate about its own role in the world, major disruptions are looming on the transatlantic relationship. And it's in the midst of this uncertainty that France plays a crucial role as the United States' oldest ally, one of its most important allies, as a critical actor in Europe and on the global stage. Resisting the populist shocks that shook much of the transatlantic community in the last 2 years, France opted for its own electoral shock and the decisive victory of an independent, of President Macron, who really pushed aside traditional actors on the French political stage with a focus on his liberal domestic reforms to renew France and France's sense of commitment and responsibility on the global stage. Very different messages than we heard from other populist elections across the Atlantic. It's pretty clear that both the European Union and our transatlantic alliance need an engaged France that takes up the mantle of leadership, based not only on its unique history and values, but also as a country that musters a sense of clarity around strategic vision and purpose, that brings real, credible military capabilities to bear on these issues, and that seems to be unlocking a sense of renewed economic vibrancy so critical to competitiveness. So the state visit on April 24th offers an opportunity in many respects to begin to think about the next chapter in U.S.-France relationship and really transatlantic relations, as this visit will be followed by a matter of days from Chancellor Merkel coming to Washington. And that's really the topic of the report that we're releasing today, the French-American Alliance and an America First Era, by our fellow Jeff Lightfoot, who is here. One of our commitments at the Atlantic Council is a commitment to, we call it intergenerational, to our rising stars, and Jeff certainly fits that bill. And the report, he argues that President Trump and President Macron inherit a strong U.S.-French partnership that's grown ever closer over the last decade, yet he identifies these issues that are going to bedevil it: economic protectionism, Iran sanctions, military conflict with North Korea, the commitments to multilateral frameworks, and the role the United States is or won't play on certain core values on the international stage. But despite some of these differences in political issues, there's a very interesting personal chemistry at stake and developing between the two men, and it epitomizes the potential for some of the opportunities for increased cooperation on job creation, on investment, the fight against terrorism, and of course today all minds are focused on the conversations between Paris and Washington on Syria, where coordinated action seems to be developing imminently. So this today at the Atlantic Council is part of our arc of programming on France here at the Council as we put a spotlight and a priority on this. We're delighted to be taking the Atlantic Council in partnership with Le Figaro and the Tocqueville Foundation to a conference in Normandy, in Tocqueville itself, this June to examine some of the common ideological and geopolitical challenges that our community faces. This conference will be just on the margins of the D-Day commemoration. We're delighted to have U.S. Ambassador to France, former U.S. Ambassador to France, Craig Stapleton, who's provided the forward for this report to help anchor that effort along with Ambassador Boyden Gray. So for today, I'm delighted that we've got Ambassador Rowe, Ambassador of France to the United States, here with us this morning. Welcome back to the Council. We're delighted that he's here to share a bit of a preview for the state visit, exploring what might expect to come out of the meetings and the assessment of the broader relationship between the two countries. After the ambassador's brief remarks, I'm going to invite Susan Glasser to come up here. We're delighted to have Susan back to the Council. She is at Politico, but headed to the New Yorker to help moderate a bit more of a deep dive, not just into the state visit, but in the broader U.S.-France relationships. We'll be joined by Pierre-André Humbert, the social policy advisor to President Macron, to speak to these really critical potential of the domestic reforms in France, to give us an insider's view on that. And they'll be joined by two Americans following this closely, the author of our report, Jeff Lightfoot, and of course, Fran Burwell, our distinguished fellow, who's also at McClarty Associates, following these issues very closely. Ambassador Rowe, let me invite you to the podium. Thank you.
Good morning. It's great to be here. First, I think it has been emphasized by Damon. The Franco-American relationship is excellent, and actually it has been very good in a sense before the election of Emmanuel Macron. Why? The Americans are pragmatic and simply consider that the French are doing the job and are doing well the job. And when I'm referring to the job, I think I'm referring first of all to our military cooperation. The fact is that for a few years, our soldiers are again shoulder to shoulder fighting terrorism on the battlefields. First in Sahel, where the French have been deploying 4,000 soldiers fighting terror, and the Americans are really helping us, supporting what we are doing, but also in the Levant, where the French have deployed very significant military means, including really an aircraft carrier. So there is a sort of credibility of the French. And I can tell you that every time I meet an American general, usually he's immediately referring to our military and intelligence cooperation. You know, really, I have a line that I love very much, is that one day my British colleague told me that every time that an American military is meeting a British military, the American is talking about the French. And you can understand that really it's something which is very sweet to hear. So cooperation between our two countries, unfortunately, simply because the enemy of my enemy is my friend, but because we are sharing the same values. So on the top of this relationship, basically has come the elections of two presidents, President Trump and President Macron. Basically, you can say that the men are very different. The two men are very different, but you have also to refer the commonality about the two elections. Basically, the French democracy and the American democracy, and you can say beyond the France and beyond the US, the Western democracies are facing exactly the same challenges. In terms that some of our voters, some of the French, some of the American voters are simply revolting in a state of rebellion against the elites and telling the elites basically you don't deliver. We consider that policy has to be made in a different way. And the two presidents have really felt this anger and are really trying to respond to this anger. The two presidents think that policy should be made in a different way. Which means also that there is, on some of the issues, there is a common identification of the problems. You know, really, talking about trade, for instance. You know, if you read the speech of President Macron in Davos, you know, the mecca of free trade and of modern capitalism, you'll see that, of course, President Macron is in favor of free trade, but he's also in favor of fair trade. You know, he has also, you know, basically identified the fact that you can't have a sort of naive free trade, opening the borders and saying, oh, it's globally good. First, globally means that there are people for which it's not good, but also the fact is that free trade could be fair only if everybody was abiding by the rules, which is not the case. We have also the Europeans, because the European trade policy is managed by the European Commission. We have real concerns, for instance, about intellectual property. And so the President Macron considers that we have to act. And again, on Iran, for instance, Iran, really, we have not waited for the American administration to express our concern about the activities of Iran. We have always said that the Iran deal is about the nuclear activities, but we have at the same time to address the other activities of Iran in terms of the policy of Iran in Yemen, in Iraq, and especially in Syria, or the support to missile proliferation, and so on and so on. So again, we have two presidents, and France, we have two presidents who are decided to look at the challenges of our time in a different way, saying we simply can't go on the old way. Our citizens have told us very clearly, act differently. And again, President Macron is decided to act differently. So, of course, you can say, and I'm sure that you will say, that the two presidents are putting on the table different solutions. First, I think it's a bit surprising to believe that you need to agree to talk. No, really, you talk especially when you don't agree. So I think it's very important that our two presidents are able to have an adult conversation on their agreements and on their disagreements. Which is great is that they will have gentlemen's agreements, but also gentlemen's disagreements, and that's what is important. Of course, you have to understand that for the President of France, whatever his political orientation, to have a good relationship with the President of the United States, who, after all, is the most powerful man in the world, it's an important and it's a need, and it's what the President Macron has been trying to build, and I think he has been a sort of successful since, it was said by Damon, it was the first state visit of the Trump administration. And so all the issues will be addressed, of course, during these meetings. The issues where we agree, the issues where we disagree. The fundamental message of the president, if you want to summarize in one word, would be together. Basically, again, we have identified the problems that our societies are facing inside, outside, and what we are convinced, what the President Macron is convinced, is the best way to face it, is to do it together. If we don't do it together, and when I say together, it's Europe, and it's not really the fact that Chancellor Merkel is coming 2 days after President Macron is really very important. It's signaling, in a sense, the same message. When I say together, it's Europe, really, France, Germany, but Europe and the United States. We have the same values, we have the same vision of the world, we have really on most of the issues, we have the same interest, so we have to face these challenges together. That's what I should say will be the message of President Macron. So thank you very much. Really, I'm ready to answer to all the questions. You may know that the President Macron will address a joint session of the Congress on April the 25th, which will be, of course, also a very important opportunity to engage into a dialogue with the Congress and beyond the Congress with the American, we hope, with the American people. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Ambassador Arro. And of course, thank you to Damon, to the Atlantic Council, and to all of you for spending a little bit of your morning with us. You can all see why it is that Ambassador Arro is considered perhaps the most articulate and skilled diplomat in Washington today. He has beautifully reframed European disagreements with the new administration as a common recognition of the problem. So I thought that was really, I have to tell you, a fantastic introduction, and I think, really what we all want to ask him. So I'm just going to jump right in here, and then we can bring in our other panelists as well. I know that all your fellow diplomats are asking you, what does France know that the rest of Europe, the rest of the world has not yet figured out about reading the Trump administration? Clearly President Macron personally, but also the French government has turned out to be quite skilled in understanding how it is possible to discern a way forward at a time when there is considerable uncertainty even within our own government as to what our policies are. So tell us, if you will, the secret of Trump whispering in 2018. How is it that France managed to get this first state dinner and to bring a president who does have substantive policy disagreements with the American president into I believe the president himself has called it a great relationship?
One word.
One word.
The ambassador.
I told you so, right?
No, I really, it's on the record. But really, no, seriously.
Write that down, that's A-R.
No, seriously, I think there are several elements. First, there is a sort of, I should say, by default or by chance, it happens that our German friends, are just out of 6 or 7 months of a political crisis to create a government. But now Mrs. Merkel is stepping in, and I'm sure that the German-American dialogue will be also very, very important in the coming months. And our British colleagues are facing the conundrum of Brexit. So in a sense, as I was saying to my young diplomats, we are living our 15 minutes of glory, of fame. So there is this element. The second element is, of course, that you have this young president and who is able to say, I have a strong parliamentary majority, I will be your interlocutor for the coming 5 years. And as I have said, however the two presidents are personally different, there are two disruptors. There are two disruptors. Really, President Macron is really saying and showing by his policy, but Monsieur Humbert will be much more able than me to say it, is a disruptor. And so the two men, Donald Trump and Emmanuel Macron, also are, in a sense, are frank.
Yeah.
Donald Trump has never hidden what he thinks, and Emmanuel Macron is the same thing. So they have built a dialogue. At the same time, I don't, really, from time to time, the American press is using people press wording, really bromance, or no, it's not a bromance, it's simply there is a common interest on both sides, really to reach an understanding. Really, any French president, wants to have good relationship with the president of the United States. It's nothing new, really nothing new. That's really the way we are obliged to work. So President Macron has decided, and he will have decided, who had been elected in Washington, that he needs to build a good relationship with President Trump.
Okay, so we've already made a headline. French ambassador, no, it's not a bromance. But I'm glad you brought up our other visitor from Paris today, Monsieur Humbert, who is, as was mentioned, President Macron's chief domestic policy advisor. And disruptor is a good word. As we walked in here to the event this morning, the headline was scrolling across the teleprompter. Defiant President Macron vows to proceed with reforms despite the pushback and the threat of strikes. So Why don't you start out by giving us, first of all, an update? The president has vowed to disrupt in a significant way the French labor code, to modernize and to really reform both political institutions as well as economic ways of working in France. How is that disrupting going for you, and how does it affect President Macron's ability to focus on international affairs, on issues like meeting President Trump or Syria, for example? Thank you.
Thank you. In a word, I could say that I think the first disruption was the electoral campaign, when President Macron has presented a comprehensive set of structural reforms, both on the economic and social side, and a set of comprehensive reforms we ever had in France. And after these elections, and it's a total upheaval of the political landscape, as Mr. Ambassador presented, with this total political upheaval transformation, we have a new majority at the French Parliament. 2/3 of the MPs are newcomers, and so it's a major change. Based on this major change, the set of comprehensive reforms relies on, I can say, 3 words. The first one is to encourage growth. And to encourage growth, you need to invest. To invest, you need capital. And that's why we have a large set of measures concerning reduction in taxes and to encourage capital gain and so on. But it's not only growth, it's an inclusive growth. That means, this is the second word, you need to protect. And to protect means you need to tackle the inequalities at its roots. Tackle the inequalities at its roots, that means you have to invest in education. That's one of the first measures and disruptive measures was to invest in education at the primary school in the poor neighborhoods, because it's where you have to tackle with the inequalities. The third very important point was, if you want to invest in human capital, you have to invest in the future in innovation. That's why the third measure to protect and is to have together a future. It's to invest in digital economy, in ecological transition, in innovation, mobility, and so on. So we have a 50 billion program of investment that has already implemented since the beginning of this year. And on the top, we have this labor market regulations and a lot of rules we had in the past prevent economic development from being stronger. And so what we have done is just to explain where we want to go by transforming our rules. Transforming our rules means that in the future we want to help people to create business, to develop, and not have so administrative burden and so many complex legal rules, but just to have negotiated rules at the company level and so on. So it's the transformation and the most important reform we have ever had in France for decades concerning the employment side. So that's why the disruption has been really implemented, and because all the measures just I can present very briefly has already been voted by the Parliament, and large part of them have been implemented. And sometimes you have transformation. You talk about the railway transportation system. You can have strike, but you have still discussion, negotiation, and the President this morning, in part of his large speech, explained why we want to go through this kind of reforms. It's not only to have a reform, because we think that in the future we will have more efficient railway services, more efficient company, and for the future, both for the economy and for the employees, and especially for the railway employees, it will be better. That's why we have to go through. I think the best difference compared to the past is that he has presented all his reform during the electoral campaign, even the structural reform, even the most difficult structural reform, and now he is implementing what he has promised before. So this is the major change, I think.
So I want to bring you in. Fran Burwell, you've watched this extraordinary development in French politics play out over the last couple of years, and it is extraordinary, right? I mean, you have a president whose party didn't exist 18 months before he became the president of the Republic of France. on the reforms and this program, this very ambitious program that's being carried out, that has already been passed by this parliament, again, dominated by a party that didn't even exist a couple years ago. What's your assessment of the level of pushback and resistance in French society? Obviously, they have the votes to push through these measures, but you know, do you see the possibility of a reaction? Is it possible that President Macron is sort of the President Obama in this scenario, and there is a Trump in France's future?
Well, I think a lot depends on how successful these reforms are, and I think what we're seeing now with the railway workers is, to some degree, to be expected. It's interesting that those who are striking are among the most privileged. And so I think...
Privileged in the sense that they have even more generous benefits.
Yeah, retire at 50. They have very generous benefits, yes. And they will keep them. It's the new workers who will not. But I think the importance of it goes beyond France. Because all across Europe, and in this country too, there is a skepticism about government looking after you. We talked in an earlier session today about those who are left behind. And I think that President Macron is trying to do a holistic reform of the economy that will move France forward. In the digital space, as the ambassador noted, and in innovation, we're seeing more people, young people, come back to Paris or talk about coming back to Paris. France is facing a big competition from other European companies as we go through Brexit and companies think about where they want to invest in Europe. So, and I think it's important that this reform succeed, because if France is really going to be the partner of Germany over the next couple of years in Europe and address issues of Eurozone reform, it has to do so from a strong domestic position. If President Macron gives in to the strikers or fails with this reform, he will be much weakened as a bargainer with the rest of Europe. The same way he has to have a successful meeting with President Trump, because he has two things to do to be a real player on the European stage in the way that Chancellor Merkel has been over the last few years, although she is now weakened. One is economic, and the other is diplomatic. He must show that this summit is not just about the US and France, but it is him as an interlocutor for Europe as well.
Well, this is a good point to bring Jeff Lightfoot in. Your report, by the way, I highly recommend to everybody. It's a terrific, really, summation of where things stand today and sort of what leads up to this moment between Trump and Macron, right? That it's not just about two men, that there's an institutional and a relationship between these countries that exists independent of whether they have a good time together. That being said, what do you think are the risks for President Macron in becoming the most visible kind of European partner with Donald Trump? He is extraordinarily unpopular in the French public, for example. And so I'm just curious, what is it that France needs to get out of this? And politically speaking, especially, what do you perceive as the challenges for President Macron in embracing Donald Trump?
Well, I think thank you for the question. I think it's a very interesting one. And the easy thing to do, there was a poll I saw on the Figaro that 9 out of 10 French people have a low opinion of Donald Trump. He almost embodies what a lot of French people find to be the worst characteristics of Americans in terms of being a billionaire who's very materialistic and almost the archetype of the ugly American in a certain sense. And the easy thing to do for President Macron, particularly given that he came from a new political party from the center, would have been in some ways to be the anti-Trump voice in Europe, to take the old playbook out of the old Gaullist playbook and say that France's greatness is going to be defined in opposition to American power. And instead, he opportunistically, I think very cleverly and very maturely understood that there was an opportunity, given that Chancellor Merkel was weak, was going through elections, had a relationship with President Obama, was a defender of refugees and things, that was not going to position her well to be President Trump's interlocutor. That, as the ambassador indicated, that the UK was not going to be in maybe the same position that it had been in the past to strike out a relationship from the outset. And so he's both pragmatic in that sense, that he didn't seek to define French greatness in contrast to American power, but I think there's also an opportunistic sense from him that he could try to be Trump's interlocutor. And I think he felt this was a necessity, because if you look at U.S.-French relations since 1958, the first paradigm under General de Gaulle was a France that needed to retake its sovereignty and then chart out a course in between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. And then after the end of the Cold War, could France help build a multipolar world while remaining an ally of the United States to balance out American hyperpower? Well, the challenge today is, I think for France and for much of Europe, is the US president seeking on being an anti-status quo actor who looks to overturn the rules-based international order that France and the European Union, and I think the United States, are actually very much reliant on. And this is where I think the stakes are quite high for President Macron. It's okay to have a good personal relationship. For France, it is intolerable to be ignored. This is what some French scholars and diplomats have told me. So France is not being ignored. But I think the stakes are getting a little higher on the domestic front as these strikes are taking place. I think for the railway workers, this is a real chance. I think they see to strike a blow against the president. And the stakes are high now. If President Macron comes here and doesn't, and Trump leaves the Iran deal and the European Union is not able to get a longer-term reprieve on steel and aluminum tariffs, then I think people are going to ask in France, what have you gotten out of this relationship that you have with President Trump? So I think this state visit is a bit of a moment of truth. And is there a return on investment in this relationship that the president will find?
Well, let me go back to the ambassador and ask to define a little bit more clearly, aside from a general good relationship, are there specific things that you think will be the test of after this state visit, whether it's worked out? You mentioned, for example, military cooperation in the Sahel, which is a big priority for France. It's not something, as you know, that is front and center in the Washington dialogue. It is, especially since the ambush of the U.S. soldiers in Niger. It's not in anybody's first 10 list of military priorities right now, at least as part of the public conversation. So that's one question. The Iran deal, obviously, France has been forceful in saying there were concerns about Iran, but not just France, the other European partners as well are working very frantically, but by most accounts in an uphill fight to convince the Trump administration to remain a party to the deal that, of course, the previous American administration took the lead in helping to negotiate. So what for you will be the test? What are the issues or the risks that you're most concerned about in terms of specifics?
First, going back to the idea of really saying Donald Trump is unpopular in France, I think the French make really very well the difference between the popularity of a leader, the feeling they have of a leader, and the need, nevertheless, of their president to talk to this leader. Mm-hmm. You know, really, the French are realistic. You know, they know what is the real world. You know, really, that you have to talk to everybody, and especially to the most powerful president in the world. The assessment of the success of a visit, we are not going, you know, in a sense, a state visit, there is something which is very ceremonial. There is, you know, really, it's also public affirmation of a relationship. But we are not going to have really saying we have to tick some boxes to assess a success or not a success. We know that it will either way, the press will do it. And considering the state, the way the press is in Washington these days, we know what will be the conclusion of the American press, and so it's, you know, our real problem is not so much these agreements. It's also the really, in a sense, the political scene in Washington D.C. We know that a part of the American press is will try to use Macron against Trump, really basically trying to oppose the two persons. And it's not, of course, there won't be any confrontation. As I have said, the two presidents have succeeded to build a relation of frankness on agreement and disagreement. It's an ongoing conversation. We are living in 2018. It means that you don't need to be there to have a conversation. Our two presidents have had at least 3 or 4 phone calls in the last week. So there is an ongoing conversation, and it's not because President Macron will be in Washington, physically in Washington, D.C., that really the Iran deal or the Iran conversation will be suddenly resolved, or the Iran disagreement will be suddenly resolved. So again, we are not living in the periods where, you know, suddenly a head of state was coming and after 6 months of silence. No, there is a dialogue. The dialogue will go on. On Iran, on the Iran deal, it will be also in the context of the negotiations, which is still going on between, on one side, the U.S., on the other side, the free Europeans and the European Union, you know, really on a lot of different issues. So it will be a good moment to take stock. The two presidents will take stock. Again, President Macron will say what he has said publicly, that we should address the concerns raised by the Iranian activities in the region, and that really, and I think, you know, there won't be any spectacular announcements on both sides. There won't be suddenly President Trump will discover the virtue of multilateralism. You know, it's not on a way of Damascus. We are not, well, actually we are, but in a very different way. So again, I really, I want to, there is no very high expectations of outcome, of spectacular outcome. It's more, you know, really this sort of keeping the dialogue, again, as you have said, very between Europe and the United States, really trying, we understand that there is a temptation in this country, and this temptation is not limited to a person. You know, after all, this person has been elected, so it's a temptation in the American society, really basically to go alone, and we want to really to convince, to repeat the message. It's better really to stay together, and to explain how to stay together, because again, we can't simply say multilateralism, you know, really, because multilateralism doesn't work. It's true. You know, you saw the UN is blocked. You saw that a lot of issues, like for instance the digital issues, are not addressed in any multilateral forum. We need a new reformed, a new effective multilateralism. The WTO, it's a problem. The president, the really. So that's a dialogue of substance about the challenges of our times. The world order that we have known, that you are calling liberal world order, that I'm calling Western-dominated world order, is collapsing. So how to face this common challenge?
Well, you're right about multilateralism. It's not exactly a slogan that fits on a T-shirt, is it? You mentioned, and I know this is not your brief, your portfolio, but you mentioned the extensive back and forth conversations this week between President Macron and President Trump on Syria. We're still waiting to see what the public outcome of those discussions will be, although President Trump's Twitter feed has suggested strongly that action of some sort is forthcoming, either imminently or, according to this morning's Twitter feed, anytime. What do you believe is France's policy when it comes to not just the chemical weapons use, but the Assad regime? There's been some question here as to whether the U.S. is still committed to the removal of Assad from power, which was the stated policy of President Obama. But in recent months, it's been suggested that President Trump would have a more narrowly defined role in Syria. What do you believe should be the role of outside Western powers in Syria after the Islamic State?
No, the prime, again, let's not, go to the issue of Assad up front. Let's look at the reality on the ground. What is the reality on the ground right now? And what are the interests of the Europeans especially? Obviously, we are facing two major threats to our security. The first one is, of course, terrorism, and the second one, which is also a political challenge, which is mass migrations. So our interest is to put an end, to face these threats, and to face these threats, what we need is to stabilize Syria. and to stabilize Syria, in a sense, we need a credible political transition. So basically, our goal, the goal of the West, should be engaging political engagement with Russia, Turkey, Iran, with the view of a political transition. There is a process, which was the process in Geneva. The reality is really that in Geneva, the delegation, the Syrian delegation, or the Damascus delegation, has not even engaged into talking about any political transition, really. And that's the problem. So, so I do think that we need to talk to the Russians, to talk to the Iranians, really to say we need a credible political transition. Really, and we consider that at the end of the process, Assad should leave because we don't see any stabilization with Assad. But for the moment, let's talk about a credible political transition with credible elections. Because if we don't have this political transition, maybe there will be the military victory of Assad and Russia, but it means that there will be millions of migrants who won't come back to Syria, basically. And there will be, again, outbursts of violence on the Syrian territory. So what we need is not a political, it's really political engagement of this administration with us and with Europeans and also with the concerned powers.
You're too diplomatic to say it, but my guess is that a barrage of cruise missiles does not increase the possibility of political dialogue, at least in the short term.
Really, it's from time to time, really a big stick has some effectiveness.
Mr. Humbert, I want to go back to what disruption looks like inside of France today. I think many Americans are extremely interested in the question of how do you achieve consensus in a divided society. And as you pointed out, President Macron did propose very clearly in his election campaign the kinds of steps that would be taken. But it's still a divided country, perhaps not as divided electorally as the United States, but still at least almost a third of French citizens have expressed some sort of support for this right-wing populism that's been voted down. What do you think are the risk factors that you are worried about when you look at the politics of this, when you're trying not only to pass these reforms, but to make sure that they're successfully accepted in French society? Do you believe that French society is less divided today than it was during the electoral campaign? What can you tell us that will give us some hope here in the United States?
Of course, there are the deep trends in all our societies. And so we know that due to globalizations, a lot of people think there are losers in the globalization and wants to reassure that they will have a future and moreover their children will have a future. And when they say future, it's not only to have good purchasing power or to have access to this or these consumptions. It's just to be sure that there is some kind of social mobility in society, that everyone has his chance to succeed. And so I think one of our goals in terms of inclusive growth is to make the opportunity to have its own destiny or its own career, to decide to be able to escape from social determination possible in our country. So that means that you have to, at each stage of your reform, to explain why we want to implement this reform, where we want to go, and to ensure people that at the end of the day there will be more social mobility. There will be a possibility to have a better life for your children in the future. I say general words, but it's stem from deep trends in our society, because sometimes the fear is higher than the reality in terms of perception, in terms of inequalities. And it's always the fact that when you compare the perceptions of inequality and you go to the fact there were some differences. And so we have to address these representations. Not only representation, we have to have more growth, we have to have more jobs, and now we have the best year we have ever had since 2007 in terms of jobs creations. We have a number of creation of companies and so on. So the economic environment is far better, the confidence is far higher. But what is very important that everybody thinks that it will be the growth will be shared and inclusive. And so that's why at each stage we try to recap this whole perception, and that was done by the president this morning to explain. We will free up the market, we will protect the workers, we will have major change, but at the end of the day, it will be an inclusive society. That's why we have to be unified, union in our country. This is, I see, the way to overcome the divisions we could have in society.
So, Fran, you've watched this unfold. The president has seen his approval rating inside France go down a little bit as a result of this. What has surprised you about the politics of this disruption, this reform effort, as it's unfolded? Do you think he is ahead of where you expected him to be so far? And does it affect his ability? I think you pointed out this fascinating connection between President Macron's need to be strong at home, right, in order to become this European leader and to have France be playing this leading role in this next stage of reinventing whatever the European Union is going to be. Where is he, do you think, domestically in terms of his political strength as a result of this pushback?
I think he's on the right path. I think what we did not anticipate with the election of President Macron was the overwhelming numbers that he would get in the National Assembly. Mm-hmm. And you basically have almost an entirely new National Assembly. Mm-hmm. And although parliamentary systems are often much more, they're not so wed to checks and balances as in our system, and so much tug between the branches of government because they're all one branch, right? But even though this is an extraordinarily unified, I would say in some ways perhaps almost too unified because you don't really get the debates. But nevertheless, it is what has allowed him to get very controversial plans through easily, early in his term. I think if you contrast this with the experience of Germany, mm-hmm. So Germany in 2002 or so was the sick man of Europe economically. Everyone knew what had to be done. And Gerhard Schröder undertook the Hartz reforms, but he did so close to the end of his term. And so he faced election with people still very angry with him. Mm-hmm. And so the person who has reaped the benefits of the Hartz reforms is Chancellor Merkel, who has seen the German economy really over the last decade do extremely well. And now we have President Macron, who is to some degree following that path, but doing so very early in his term and with the unified assembly.
And of course they have a longer presidential term.
And they have a longer, so in 4 years, 5 years, you know, if things go according to plan, which they never do, but one can be optimistic, they should be starting to see the growth that comes from this investment that they want to encourage.
But let me just push you a little bit on that before we come back to the international piece. The Le Pen voters have not disappeared.
No.
You know, so what do you think is their response going to be? What does the backlash look like so far? What do you anticipate it will look like?
I think the backlash depends upon, number one, can he connect? And he's decentralizing some of these things so that I think that puts it in a more, you know, it's less distant to Paris, even though it's not particularly distant to Paris from anywhere in France. But also I think it's going to be jobs. Jobs, jobs, jobs. And if they can create enough jobs, if Le Pen voters, if the older Le Pen voters feel that their children have a chance, they will move away from that. But I think this is crucial because everywhere in Europe, you are right, that there are these groups of voters who feel out of the system. So Alternative for Deutschland did not win, but they are the official opposition now in Germany, and somehow we have to figure out how to address their voters, what makes them feel that they want to vote for such a party. And we see that as well in a bigger sense in countries like Hungary. So the question of what do you do, how do you bring Le Pen voters back into feeling that the system works for them, which I think is the thing you need to do. France is now the leading laboratory. So we'll have to see what happens, but he's on the right track. Whether others will have the nerve to upend their political systems. Because what I think
or the ability to
or
do
the
so.
ability, but I think what we're facing in Europe is something that we're facing here too, where the established political parties do not address the concerns of the voters, or at least a segment of the voters who have been upended themselves by globalization.
Well, actually, and Jeff, before I bring you in, I want to ask Mr. Ambert actually this question. It's very early days, obviously, still, of President Macron, right? Do you believe that En Marche is permanently a part of the French political landscape already? Is it possible that France would go back to the party system that existed before? Or do you think that it's already a new France when it comes to what political parties there are and what the organization of politics is?
Well, you have a transformation concerning political parties. The political parties we will have in the future won't be the same that we have in the past. In terms of organization, and you say that there was the biggest surprise was the election of Emmanuel Macron, which was really close to the citizens' expectations, that we have a direct relationship with all the people, and with a different kind of organization in terms of parties. And it was, we have another different initiative, but it was different from the past. So for the far left parties, candidate Jean-Luc Mélenchon, we has tried not to have the typical old party, but some kind of direct relationship by the social media, by his own TV, and so on. So this is a transformation of the political landscape, not only because we have a new leader, because we have newcomers in the political area, but also because there is really a transformation about how the parties play their role in the society. So I think this there won't be any backlash concerning this. This is the future will be different from the past even concerning the typical relationship we had in the past between unions and parties and so on. This is a transformation because a lot of our citizens want to be part of some movements, but not to be committed to all the stuff we had before in the party. So that's why this is a deep transformation. And of course, you have an opposition, a political, you have different parties and so on. But this is a deep trend in the transformation of the political issues.
One thing I would just add to that we haven't talked about, and the ambassador and Mr. Ambert can probably speak to it more articulately than I have, but there's also an effort to reform the political system within France itself in terms of, there's a dialogue going on about cutting the number of parliamentarians and senators, limiting term limits. One of Macron's very first things was to try to clean up some of the ethics around parliaments. And so we might be talking about a President Fillon if it wasn't for this whole issue of candidate Fillon having his wife on the payroll and things like that. So this, and also some proportionality in the elections to try to get some of these other political voices into the debate. And I think this is one of the most interesting concepts that the president's put forward, because it's a little bit out of a recognition that the elite in France also have to take their share of the pain, in addition to asking people to take on some of the burden as well through reforms. And I'm going to be very interested to see how that goes. But I think it's the right concept of asking the elite to make their own reforms as well.
Well, and that's the question, is it going to be harder to implement that part of it?
I think I want also maybe to address another issue about President Macron, the fact that he's addressing upfront some issues, and especially issues of identity. And I think, really, immigration, really, there was a draft law to the bill, which is toughening the law, really, but also making more human the way we are handling the immigration issue. But, he gave 2 days ago or 3 days ago an interview on religious issues. And you know that in a sense, the religious issues, that's always been a very difficult issue in French politics. And it's getting more, more difficult because there is a problem of how Islam will be integrated in the French society, but also the relationship with the Roman Catholicism. And, he has given, really a very, in a sense, disruptive interview, which has had actually disruptive consequences on the political scene. But also you have to be also the fact that the president is also very attentive to, I should say, the national symbols. Really the symbols really linked to national identity, the flag, the national ceremonies, really. So again, he has a holistic vision of the problems of our societies. He knows that we have a lot of social economic problems, but there is also the doubt of the society. Like all the Western societies, about where are we going, who are we, and he's trying to answer to these questions. Not usually the elites, basically dismiss that, really. But he's not dismissing it, and he's trying to answer it, but in an inclusive way again, and progressive way, really. And that's also, I think, an important part of the equation.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. First of all, we're going to have questions in just a second, so get your questions ready. Jeff, I want to turn to you, which goes to this question of France's identity going forward, and the fact that the election of President Macron in some way has raised that as an issue. And you wrote in your report, I think, about the debate on the foreign policy side.
Yeah.
What kind of leadership role do you think France is prepared or aspires to play in the world right now? You wrote of this as almost a conflict between somewhat outdated Gaullist notions of France as a sort of independent thinker when it comes to the Euro-Atlantic alliance. But is that an outdated way of looking at things? Tell us a little bit about the debate over France's future role in the world, what it aspires to be.
Well, I think that this is a great question because there is a foreign policy debate taking place amongst the foreign policy elite in France, mostly in the French language. And there's been some discussion that the debate is as foreign policy paradigms are, between this sort of idea of going back to a Gaullist heritage. And President Macron, to some degree, helped put this back on the table when as candidate he was saying he wanted to go back to a Gallo-Mitterrandian idea of foreign policy, which gets back to an idea of strategic autonomy, being an ally of the United States, but maybe not always aligned with the United States. But I think that debate is a little bit past. I'm a big admirer of General de Gaulle, but we don't live in that strategic context, which I described about 20 minutes earlier. What you do see in France is a general consensus around the fact that France needs to keep its nuclear deterrent and therefore keep a sense of strategic autonomy, that it should matter in the world and it should keep its political weight and rank, which is why you're seeing reinvestment in defense and a desire to keep an autonomous defense industry, a desire to play a role in shaping and defining Europe. But what I sense is a little bit of a change of generation from the past, and I saw a little bit of a change of generation at breakfast with you. I was joking with your embassy staff, an advisor to the French president who comes and gives an English-speaking PowerPoint structured down. You look like you're out of McKinsey. And there is a change of generation going on in France, and I see it on the domestic front, and I see it on the foreign policy front, where there's less of an angst, I think, about the relationship with the United States. And I think that this debate between the so-called French neoconservatives and the so-called Gaullist realists is a bit of a false paradigm, because the Gaullists had their moments of tremendous solidarity with the United States, tremendous cooperation, and the so-called more pro-American presidents like Sarkozy and Hollande also had their own areas of great divergence. But I think the important thing is that there is this broader consensus that France ought to matter and have heavy weight in world affairs. But the concern I do have is those extreme voices that Fran had indicated took about 40-45% of the electorate in the first round. Many of them have a reflexive anti-Americanism on the far left and on the far right. I know there was this maybe hope amongst some on the Breitbart crowd here that Marine Le Pen and President Trump could have a great relationship, but the far right is a fundamentally anti-American party in France.
Well, we forget it was
that.
also President Trump who seemed to encourage that, not just those of his supporters. Ambassador, do you agree with Jeff's view of sort of where France is at in terms of its debate about what role it wants to play in the world?
Well, there is, again, there is a debate, in any democratic society. But the fact is that when you look at the French foreign policy, it has been extremely consistent, for over the last 50 or 60 years. And we have elected left-wing and right-wing presidents. our foreign policy, like the American foreign policy, is based on the defense of our national interest. And so our policy has moved on when the circumstances have changed. So really, so right now, so we, you know, if you look at the real foreign policy, you have to look at what are our national interests, which means what are the threats against our national interests right now. As I've said, first we have terrorism, which means not only law enforcement in our border, within our borders, but outside of our borders, trying to eradicate, fight the terrorists, and also, of course, trying to solve the sources of terrorism. I was speaking about the Syrian civil war, which is obviously for us a major concern, but also the destabilization of the Sahel region, really. So the president has invested a lot of his political capital and time into going beyond the military solution in the Sahel region, because you know we could be there for generations if we don't solve the social, economic sources of the crisis in the Sahel region. So that's really, really an example. He has also inherited other conflicts, like the Ukraine conflict, since the French and the Germans really are managing this conflict. But beyond that, if you go into the wider stage, you know, really basically he's facing what we all face, which means the collapse of the world order and how to build a new world order. And as I've said, he considers that the main threat that we are facing is that after the collapse of the order, the day will be for nationalism. Really, everybody fighting for itself without any accepted rules, any accepted institutions. And it's against the European vision of the world. And that's really, so that's what he's trying to advocate. And again, as you said, multilateralism is not that sexy, but nevertheless, as I've said, together, really, let's try to find solutions together. He's also, considering his generation, he's also aware that foreign policy is not limited to the interstate rivalries, that we have a lot of new issues, and these new issues, in a sense, may be also unifying issues, really saying we are all concerned by these issues. When he's talking about the digital world, or when he's talking about the biodiversity, where he's talking about the future of the oceans, of climate, you know, really, it's Europe has to be the voice, in a sense, of the common good. You know, it may sound emphatic, but we have to convince the Chinese, the Americans, the Russians, that there is, above our national interests, which are legitimate, there is the idea of a common good. You know, common, in a sense, a common good and common goods. You know, the oceans are common to all of us. And you know they are dying. So really there is also this voice, and which is the normal, the traditional European voice.
Okay, it's time for questions. And do me a favor, we have a microphone here. Identify yourself and do make it a question so that we can go on. You, sir.
Hi, Bill Drozdiak, Brookings. Ambassador Rowe, I understand that President Macron played a leading role in coordinating the expulsions of Russian diplomats after the Skripal poisoning. He's going to Moscow next month. Do you think he will pursue a policy to try and isolate Russia because of its behavior, or is there a way of bringing it back into a more cooperative posture? And for Monsieur Ambert, I wonder if you could address the question of changing the mindset in France about labor and the state. 56% of the French economy is in the public sector. 1 out of 5 workers is working for the state. I saw a poll recently that showed university graduates in France, their favored profession is to become a civil servant. So how do you turn people's minds around so that they don't remain so dependent on the state and adopt a more entrepreneurial attitude, which is what the president wants them to do?
As for Russia, on one side, basically, we consider that Russia has legitimate concerns about the world order, that we have also to talk to the Russians, to discuss with the Russians these concerns. But of course, we deeply disagree with the way they handle, they respond to these concerns. So the dialogue, first firmness, to send really clearly the message to the Russians that the way they are acting is actually counterproductive, is going against their interest. But at the same time, having a dialogue with the Russians, and in a sense saying, you are not satisfied by the world order, and so what is your vision of the future? How do you see the future of the world? Again, with this idea that this world that we have to rebuild, we rebuild this world, it won't, we are getting out of a Western-dominated order. Basically, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we had this hyperpower time, really with the West dominating the world. Now it's not possible anymore. But at the same time, if you look at the Security Council, you will say that it's dominated by the West, the IMF, and so on. So again, we are back to the idea of a reform multilateralism. We have to bring all the stakeholders to the table. But at the same time, if the stakeholders are coming to the table, they shouldn't toss the table. They shouldn't work over the table and not under the table. So basically, I think that's, again, I'm not the president, but I think that's what we will try to, what the president will try to tell President Putin, saying, we are ready to work with you, but working with you means working together means also respecting rules, and we are open to dialogue. Isolating Russia will be totally, really senseless.
So which is easier, Russia or reforming the public sector?
Yeah, I think Russia is maybe more. I don't know, but we were close to have the Moscow temperature, and then no, the thing, I think there is a big change, I think, in the new generation compared to what, because more and more young people want to, after their scholarship and university and so on, to create their own company, more and more. And even it's now the first choice before joining large companies or joining French administration. And in the French administration, a lot of people want to have a break to create their company, to have other experience. And what we intend to do is to allow the possibility to recruit from, for example, private sector, to have for 5 or 3 years experience to manage some public services and so on. So more mobility between sectors. It's part of what we want to encourage instead of social mobility. The mobility has to be part of all our divided sometimes sector, not the public sector, the private one, but to be more and more, to have a career with different moments. That's why it's one of our concern is to help people to take this kind of initiative, especially the new generation, but the generation who are currently employed, and for example, to be able to take risk and to be an entrepreneurship. That's why we have some kind of new universal unemployment insurance coverage, even for entrepreneurship. Because if you take risk, you must have a second chance if you fail. And if you have another failure in the private sector, you can have another chance. And it's very important to say, if you want to take initiative, you will have some protection to help them to take initiative. And so the initiative, I think, is widely shared within the society, and especially young generations, and not so stick to one employer. They know that the content of the jobs will change in the future, and so they require from the governments to have the tools and the assets to be able to handle with this changing environments. That means skills, that means investment, university, and so on. So I think there is a support to change because to be prepared for the future, and even in the public sector, if I can say. And just a point, you know that we have 50% of the expenses, which is not public sector, but mutualized. That explains that sometimes we have a public sector, but which is smaller than he was before.
I'm Harlan Ullman from the Atlantic Council. Susan, you did a masterful job of moderating. Thank you. My question is for the ambassador, and I'd like to really follow up on Russia. It seems to me that with an attack on Syria almost inevitable, we could be approaching the crisis point of the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 or the October 1973 Middle East War, in which the Americans went to DEFCON 3. And interestingly, President Nixon then faced not only impeachment, but near certainty of conviction. Going to Moscow, and it seems to me asking President Putin what his vision is not going to be very helpful. I think being much more helpful, are there points that we might be able to reconcile with the Russians for some positive steps? Ukraine does not seem to be likely, but arms control, New START is coming apart, INF may be disavowed. Are there trade-offs possibly over sanctions for something else? Could there be some kind of talks to explain deconfliction to the incident at sea, air, and ground to prevent further mishaps? What are your views about pushing Russia to see if there are concrete areas that we can try to improve the relationship rather than let it continue to erode, which I fear after our attack in Syria it will?
Basically, is what I said is really basically right now the dialogue with Russia, in a sense, all the channels are more or less closed, and when President Macron is going to St. Petersburg, actually, I think it's not Moscow, it's St. Petersburg. For the moment, he's going to St. Petersburg. The way he's going to try, really, when he's meeting President Putin, to see whether it's possible to reopen a channel, to have a channel of conversation. A channel of conversation won't be, when I said vision, it won't be a philosophical discussion about, it will be a discussion on precise issues, and of course the most pressing issue is Syria. Really, basically is, and we are back to what I said about what is a political, whether a political transition, a political solution is possible. The Russians pretty know that a total victory of Assad is not possible. The Russians really know that at some moment they need really to shift to a political process. But at the same time, we suspect they are really not going to, or because they can't or they don't want to deliver Assad. So again, we need to have a dialogue, a conversation with the Russians, and it will be on the precise issues. At the same time, which is striking is, as you say, that the president is going to St. Petersburg, but at the same time, the president has really said today, still, we have evidence that there will be use of chemical weapons by the Syrians, and there will be consequences. And he has led the effort for expelling diplomats from the European capitals. So it's really firmness, but also openness to really to have a dialogue with the Russians. I think it's totally critical.
All right, you.
Hi, I'm Ethel. I'm from Medial News Service. I'm writing a story for the Market Watch, and I want to ask the ambassador. You said several times that the France is trying to be together with the U.S. But can we get a message of how he wants the trade and economic relationship between the U.S. and France? Do they want more free trade or bilateral and multilateral relationship, or fight together for IP theft or some other kind of things like market access challenge in other countries? And my second question is, because the honorable advisor mentioned that France is trying to do economic reform in the country and want to get more investment. I want to know how much does France cherish the U.S. investment for the country and for the making jobs and help the economic reform. Thanks.
Okay, subject of a whole other conversation, I'm sure, but let's take a quick crack at that.
This is to answer your question concerning foreign investment and especially U.S. investment in Europe and especially in France. And of course, it's the reform have been implemented is only for a couple of months. But the confidence is back, and the confidence for foreign investment too. And as we had the last numbers of the last year, 1917, and especially the last quarter, we have been in Europe the one where there was the most important number of investment creating jobs in Europe, in France. It's roughly 20% of the investment of foreign companies in Europe targeted France. I'm talking about investment concerning creating job investment. And so there is an increase right now, and the confidence is here, and we want to create the environment which could be the most favorable environment to invest in France. So we are confident, and we make our efforts to welcome the investment, because we give clear rules and favorable environment for development.
Do you want to say anything about that?
No, in terms of trade, it's the European Union which is competent for our external trade. Commissioner Malmström was here, and she had, really, she agreed with Secretary Ross to create a working group to address the possible disagreements, and especially the question of potential tariffs on steel and aluminium. But beyond this question, to address also other questions, and as I've said, intellectual property, the functioning of the WTO. Really the Americans have some concerns with the functioning of the arbitration board. I think it's not the right name, but the arbitration board of the WTO. Actually, we have also our concerns, so why not to work together on this issue?
Okay. I think we probably have time just for one more question. So, have at it.
Le Figaro.
Thank you. Philippe Gély with Le Figaro. A question for Ambassador Arro and maybe Jeff as well. I understand the value of trying to forge a good relationship with the US president in spite of differences. I'd like to know what you put in the result column so far in concrete terms. Thank you.
By definition, I'm not able to do it for some really, I think, methodological reason. When you have an ongoing dialogue, it's very difficult to know whether what has been decided by one side or the other side is the result of this conversation. It's an ongoing conversation. I could tell if I wanted to brag, and as a Frenchman, I never brag. As you can say, that for instance, President Trump went to Davos really it was an advice of President Macron, who said, you should go and you should deliver your message. But again, it's a bit anecdotal, and I'm quite convinced it's, again, we have an ongoing conversation, and so I can't really say, oh, this decision has been really taken because of Macron or because of Trump. But I'm sure that on this side, Trump is not able to say it's because of Macron and Macron because of Trump. Really, when you have head of state, try to imagine what is the responsibility of head of state, and in a sense, the loneliness of a head of state. Really, and when they are discussing with other head of states, in a sense, they are more or less facing, really the same loneliness and the same challenges. And I'm sure that this exchange has consequences on the both men, but I'm really, again, I'm not sure. Even if on the Iran deal, even if the President Trump would change his mind on the Iran deal, I wouldn't say it's Macron who changed his mind in the Iran deal, because there is a lot of people with whom President Trump is talking to every day. And there is also the people around him. So it's, again, for methodological reasons, I don't think that really it's possible to answer to your question.
Jeff, untethered by the constraints of the diplomatic service, you get the last word here.
I do. Conceptually, I agree with the ambassador. It's a relationship that this isn't like, Nixon goes to China and we have not had this relationship before. It was in excellent shape before. I think the benefit is it's still actually in pretty good shape, right? I mean, there's been some things that Paris would not have liked, leaving the climate accords, recognition of Jerusalem. Emmanuel Macron made his position on that very clear. He's made his position clear on trade. And so, first of all, the position of France is well understood. Second of all, the alternative perspective is understood. I think this is important because there was a lot of hope here that maybe staffers would save the international order, and President Trump really didn't matter. I think personal dialogue and exchange with this president really matters, and I think that it matters that it happens in English and not through a translator. And this president is capable of doing that. I know there's been some achievements on the Sahel in terms of American support, in terms of development assistance, which might not have been expected from this administration, that could perhaps be pointed to. But I think, as the ambassador indicated, we've been supporting France in the Sahel under two different presidents, and so I think there's been some continuity in U.S. support for Europe, by the way. A president who thought in the campaign that NATO was obsolete has actually been a better president for NATO than Barack Obama. I think if you look at the reinforcements, European Deterrence Initiative, and the measures that he's taken in terms of deterring Russia, I think there's actually more to show for there than the last president in a strange way, and some of the investments going into NATO. So that's maybe a more undiplomatic way of answering that question.
All right, well, I think on that note, we have to end. What a fantastic conversation. I want to thank the Atlantic Council, Damon, and especially our panelists. And unfortunately, though, we've gotten through this whole conversation. We haven't talked about the military parade. We haven't talked about, is France going to pay for it? I'm sure the Pentagon would like that. But no, I want to thank all of you, and I look forward to the follow-up conversation that surely we should have, both on the politics inside France and how the disruption is going internationally. So thank you to everyone, and thank you.
Thank you very much.